Thanks for having me. My name is indeed Simon Arrowsmith. It's good to be with you today. So, a couple of things. Let me just go through what we're going to talk about over the next half an hour or so, and make sure that you'll understand the objectives of this session. So today we'd like to cover a couple of things. I want to persuade you that stories and storytelling are a useful tool to use in interpreting and sharing data and insights. I'm going to look at the storytelling brain and what it is that's going on in here and why that's important, why you should care about it. We'll then switch our focus to the idea of finding a core narrative point, and therefore sort of thinking about how that data leads to insight leads to a core narrative point. Then we'll look at selling your data, so taking you from insight hopefully to being a bit more inspiring with your content, and focusing on the idea of story structure and the elements across your content, so that when you are unearthing data, you're sharing it in a way that makes sense to your audience and viewer. So a little bit about me and my story before we kick off. I've been working in the world of story officially for 10 years through my companies Grow the People and Iambic. I've been in the game, I think I say a little bit longer than that, given that my studies several years ago were in theatre, not as an actor, I hesitate to add, as a writer and as a composer. I still work in theatre today, but it is a very small part of my world. The main part of my role is running workshops on storytelling and on content creation, actually creating content. So you'll notice I've got two companies there. One is a content creation company, and one is running coaching and consulting around stories and storytelling. And that's all we do. We work on communications and storytelling. It's something that's very passionate. I'm very passionate about, and I know that word is overused a lot, but I think that's an easy thing to say when it comes to story, because actually story is so much a part of who we are. So as we go through the session, hopefully you'll understand why I'm passionate about story, and you'll probably recognize that actually, even if you don't think so yourself, you're probably more passionate about it than you realize. So I've worked in-house and I've worked as on the agency side, quite a lot of different sorts of organizations, and I've worked with IGD several times now, and this is my third opportunity to speak, but the first time virtually. So let's kick off. We're going through the idea of taking you from simple information, data points, statistics through this lens and saying, okay, well, what does all that stuff mean, which usually people are good at and usually people are okay at. It's then how do you make sure that you then translate that into something that's going to stick with your audience and enable them to act on it. So I guess the first question I want to ask you is, do you think you're a good storyteller? Do you think you're currently a great storyteller? So actually, Robin, if we could run the first poll question now, we'll see what sort of results we get. Okay, so let's just see what people have come up with.
Jagging, not sagging. Spell it backwards, I'ma leave it at that. That ain't got nothing to do with rap. Get up. Just like that. 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 I know this is a shock. Screaming gangster 20 years later. Of course, endorse while consciousness faded. New generations believe in them fables. Gangsta boogie on 2 turntables. Thank you for letting us be ourselves. So don't mind me if I repeat myself. These simple lines be good for your health. To keep them crime rhymes on the shelf. Live love life like you just don't care. 5,000 never scared. Bring the noise, it's the moment they feared. Get up, still a beautiful idea. know what goes on. Rolling stones of the rap game, not bragging. Lips bigger than Jagger, not sagging. Spell it backwards, I'ma leave it at that. That ain't got nothing to do with rap. Get up. Just like that. Get up. Just like that. Get up. Just like that. Get up. Just like that.
I know this is a shock.
Screaming gangster 20 years later. Of course endorsed while consciousness faded. New generations believe in them fables. Gangsta Boogie on 2 turntables. Thank you for letting us be ourselves. So don't mind me if I repeat myself. These simple lines be good for your health. To keep them time rhymes on the shelf. Live love life like you just don't care. Never scared. Bring the noise, it's the moment they feared. Get up, still a beautiful idea.
Yo, right now, kick the bass for them brothers and let them know
What goes on? Rolling stones of the rap game, not bragging. Lips bigger than Jagger, not sagging. Spell it backwards, I'ma leave it at that. That ain't got nothing to do with rap. Get up.
just like that.
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 I know this is a shock.
Screaming gangster 20 years later. Of course endorsed while consciousness faded. New generations believe in them fables. Gangsta Boogie on 2 turntables. Thank you for letting us be ourselves. So don't mind me if I repeat myself. These simple lines be good for your health. To keep them time rhymes on the shelf. Live love life like you just don't care. Never scared. Bring the noise, it's the moment they feared. Get up, still a beautiful idea.
Yo, right now, kick the bass for them brothers and let them know
What goes on? Rolling stones of the rap game, not bragging. Lips bigger than Jagger, not sagging. Spell it backwards, I'ma leave it at that. That ain't got nothing to do with rap. Get up.
just like that.
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 I know this is a shock.
Screaming gangster 20 years later. Of course endorsed while consciousness faded. New generations believe in them fables. Gangsta Boogie on 2 turntables. Thank you for letting us be ourselves. So don't mind me if I repeat myself. These simple lines be good for your health. To keep them time rhymes on the shelf. Live love life like you just don't care. Never scared. Bring the noise, it's the moment they feared. Get up, still a beautiful idea.
We've got about 70% of people say they do okay. 26% say they're rubbish. Okay, and yeah, 4% say they're great. That's great. Okay, let's close that poll. Good, you can see me again. Technology's working. We like that. Actually, the truth is, we're all really exceptional storytellers. Why do I say that? Well, this thing in between our ears is telling stories all the time. It's shaping stories. Stories are on the go constantly. So I would say we're all actually exceptional storytellers. That isn't necessarily the question you answered, and what I meant by that question. It's about how do you use stories in an effective way with data. But whether you know it or not, you've got the ability already within you to share great stories. And what we're going to do today is unpack some stuff, and quite a bit today will be obvious. I hope it's obvious, because it is part and parcel of who we are. I'm going to demonstrate that now, just quickly with a quick video for you. So I want you to have a quick look at this little clip that I'm going to show. And as it's playing, it's a silent movie, so there's no sound. As it's playing, I want you to think about what is going on here. And if you want to, please put your answers, your responses into the fields that Robin said, the questions field, as we go through. So I'm going to play this video. You put your responses in and we'll see what people think. So here we go. So what do we think was going on there? Any thought? Nobody's commented yet. Maybe you're all just stunned. When I show that video, a number of things happen. So people are sort of a bit surprised by it, and I get lots of different responses. Some people say they see a large aggressive bully over two smaller bullies. Some people say it's two individuals challenging a sort of an older individual that they think of the square box as a house, and perhaps that's the homeowner, and the two little ones are thieves, for example. I get that it's some sort of love triangle, that the little triangle is trying to steal the circle away from the big triangle. I get all sorts of responses. Very rarely, though, do I get the response that this is just random shapes moving around on a screen. That's not what we want to see. That's not what the brain is looking for and interpreting. It takes that data, that narrative, that information that's on that film, and goes, it has to mean something. It has to have some kind of rationale. And so our brain churns through this storytelling engine, which is contained within it, which I'll look at in a second, to try and make sense, to create meaning. That's what we're doing all the time. When we're presented with data, we are trying to create meaning from it. Now, one of the other things that happens when I show that video is, as I said, I get a number of different responses. People see a number of different things. Now, that's a problem, because if you are trying to get across a point, actually, you don't want a number of different interpretations of that point. You want a single moment of truth. So by adding in and being more explicit with a story layer, you can help your audience see your point of view more clearly. Let's spend a little bit of time thinking about what a story is, and then we'll get into how do we build one up. Well, a story, this is the dictionary definition of a story: a narrative, either true or fictitious, in prose or verse, designed to interest, amuse, or instruct the hearer or reader. A tale. My problem with that is it doesn't really, that could be anything. That doesn't really tell me what a story is. And part of the problem I think we have with this word story and storytelling is that it's used so often. Lots of people, oh, it's, if you started watching Strictly, you'll hear that term, oh, it's great storytelling. Maybe it is, maybe some of it is, but quite often it's just people doing certain things and us making an interpretation. I would argue that a story is more along the lines of this: a way, particularly for business and data storytelling, a way of communicating a relevant message to an audience using emotional context with relatable characters who address conflicts in order to change, grow, or learn. So that term, emotional context, really what's happening in your brain, the parts that are really spiking when we hear stories is our emotional centers, the centers that help us create meaning, and the centers that refer back to the context around which this story is told. And I think that particularly that last one, context, is really important when we're dealing with data, because data doesn't live on its own. A data point may be true, but actually it lives within the context. And when we're talking about core narratives and insights narratives, the context in which that data point lives is really important. And it, of course, we're trying to make sense and make meaning. I think the thing that helps translate that is emotion. And we'll talk about how the role emotion plays as we go through this. So let's have a look at why story. So I think I've started this already, but I think it's worth expanding that a little bit so you understand this storytelling brain. Mark Turner, who is a psychologist from America, talks about story being the fundamental instrument of thought, the way that we predict the future, we plan, explain, that our thinking is actually organized as stories in terms of the brain. And, we are getting fat, if you like, off the information. We're getting bombarded with information all the time and data all the time. So if we want information to cut through, we need to find a way to hook the brain in and make sure that it's that when people are paying attention to our data, they're doing so by sharing a story. So much information is getting lost, so much data is getting lost out there because we're not translating it in the right way. And part of that is related to the fact that when we just share information, when we share simple data, we're only lighting up a small part of the brain, the two parts that deal with speech and cognition, recognition. What we want to do is light up much more of the brain when we tell a story, which is what happens. We light up the parts of the brain that deal with human empathy, that deal with our own personal experience, and actually the physical connections in our brain. So let's just quickly take a look at each one of those. Empathy, is all about putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So when we hear a story, our instinct is to go, how would I be in that situation? What would I do? We're looking for access points through characters, for example, into the story so that we build empathy. And there's been quite a bit of study around this, particularly from neuroscience, to show that the centers of the brain that light up when you hear a story relate to the parts that deal with empathy. We also, when we hear a story, go back into our past. So we like the parts of the brain that look at where we store long-term memory, where we think about our personal experience. And we think about, well, what in my makeup, what in my past relates to what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing. With information, we just let it go. But with a story, we empathize with the character and we go, what from my experience has happened in a similar way. The last one, and this is the one I think is most important really, is the physical connections in our brain. When we hear a story, we get a little shot of a number of different chemicals, but the most important one in this instance is dopamine. Dopamine is the pleasure hormone. It's what gets released when we have chocolate and alcohol, for example. It's related to addiction. It's possibly why Netflix knows that when you've got that cliffhanger, you're going to press on the next chapter. You're just going to keep going and binge watching. What happens when we hear a story or when we watch a story or experience a story is we get a little shot of dopamine. And dopamine is important to us for memory retention because it is a neurotransmitter. So when we get the shot of dopamine and we fire off this neurotransmitter, it actually makes the connections in the brain fatter, if you like. It makes them more solid. And therefore, it's easier to remember a story from, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago than it is to remember a data point from last week. So story really is your friend if you are trying to get across a point of view. And what I often say is that a story is always being told. There's always a story being told. It just depends on whether you're telling it or whether your audience is telling it for themselves. So let's shift our focus then, now that we've looked at how story works in the brain and why stories are important, to how do you tell a story. So I'm going to start off by sharing the 4 kind of key elements of a story. And I think it's best done by looking at an example and having you think about what that might mean for you. So I'm going to show you a video, and then what I'd like you to think about is, what are the 4 elements that are working this video? We'll run a poll, and you can have a quick think about what are the 4 key elements that are involved to tell a story. So let's launch a film. Here we go.
Well, yo, right now, kick the bass for them brothers and let them know
What goes on? Rolling stones in the rap game, not bragging. Lips bigger than Jagger, not sagging. Spell it backwards, I'ma leave it at that. That ain't got nothing to do with rap. Get up,
Just like that.
get up,
Just like that.
get up,
Just like that.
get up.
Just like that.
I know this is a shock.
Screaming gangster 20 years later. Of course, endorsed while consciousness faded. New generations believe in them fables. Gangsta Boogie on 2 turntables. Thank you for letting us be ourselves. So don't mind me if I repeat myself. These simple lines be good for your health. To keep them crime rhymes on the shelf. Live love life like you just don't care. 5,000 never scared. Rain and noise is the moment they feared. Get up, still a beautiful idea.
Okay, so Robin, if we're ready, I think we should run the next poll. What do you think are the 4 key elements of a story based on what you've just seen in that advert? So there's a couple of different options for you there. Do you think it's character, interest, plot and progress? Do you think it's message, character, conflict and plot? Or do you think it's message, character, emotions and plot? So interesting. Okay, well, I think I've tricked you. I would agree absolutely with the 80% of you that said message, character, emotions and plot. Emotions are very, very important in a story, but they're not one of the key elements that we need in order to create a story. They are something that is generated up there. 78% said that. Fantastic. Thanks, Robin. Yes. So as I was saying, emotions are important, but they are the product. They are the thing that gets released, if you like. They are the result of a story. The 4 key elements you need in telling a story, and these create emotion, are message, conflict, character, plot, or message, character, conflict, plot. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time running through those from a broad story perspective, and then what that means in terms of data stories. So a message, really this is all about, what are you trying to say? What impact do you intend your content and your story to have? What's it all about? It's really important, and you'd be surprised how few people, sometimes people just don't have this to hand, a clear idea of what they're trying to say. Next up is conflict. So given that we know we've got a message we want to say, we're trying to think about what are the barriers that need to be overcome through this, sort of what are the problems that need to be solved, and those problems of course belong to a character. And a character is really the key access point into our story. The characters are what make stories relatable. So the more human they are, even if they are not human characters. So I often say that Finding Nemo is not a story about fish, is it? Really, it's a story about humans. So we always have human characteristics, have to be relatable. They're our access point in. And finally, there's the plot, which is the series of events, and I'll take you through them, the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story, the core facts that support your message. So When we're talking about this in terms of data, let's see how that translates, because that's all very well for building some kind of fairy tale or Netflix saga or some kind of film. What does that mean for data? Well, realistically, the message is, you know, what is the data telling you? What's the insight that you can gather? Then I think really important is, okay, you've got that, so what? What do you want people to do with your data? What do you want them to action as a result of reading the data? Is it just pure information, or is there a purpose to it? So what? The conflict then is all about the barriers in the mind of your audience. What are the tension points that your data addresses or maybe creates for them? The character is, why does this data matter to your audience? That's all about thinking about who are you speaking to and why is it relevant to them? What makes that, the reference insight that you come up with, relatable for your audience? And finally, the plot is those core data points that support the message, and they are structured in as a beginning, middle, and end. It's the data plus the insight, and I'll talk a little bit about what that shape of the journey looks like. Let's go through a quick example around finding an insight. So I spend a lot of my time working with a data company, an insights company called Delineate. They do research into a number of different areas, and what I do is I work with them on their storytelling. So taking raw data like the stuff you're seeing in front of you and turning it into content like videos, blog posts, thought leadership, etc. So we recently, obviously, with everything that's happening with COVID, they've been running a COVID tracker, and we've been making sure that as we just take the raw data from the COVID tracker, we relate back to how it works and what that means in terms of context and what the story that data is telling us. So one point that I thought was interesting that kind of illustrates how a narrative is born is this slide here, which hopefully you can see, is all about trust in government, and the fact that when we started the pandemic, trust in government was quite high. Now, as we get towards the second lockdown, hooray for tomorrow, in the UK, trust is now lower, much lower in government. So here we were looking the sort of insight is about the tension between that initial data point and the last data point. Really simple stuff, but actually it's all about the fact that trust has fallen. And what we want to explore through a story is why has that trust fallen? What is it around that? So that's where we go to our context. We would do extra research that says, okay, the data tells me trust is fallen from this date to this date. What is that about? What happened early on that's perhaps not happening now, or has something systematically happened as we've gone through the pandemic to erode trust? And for this, for example, we saw additional data that told us that actually it was around inconsistency of messaging, perhaps from government, and that led to a lack of trust in people. So what we're trying to do when we're creating that narrative insight is looking for the big tension points in our data. And if you only have a single data point, it's about how that data point plays within the context in which it sits, so the world around. Once we've got that, of course, that's all lovely and great. We've got that. We've then got to share it in a way that is compelling, and that's where the sort of story structure part of story comes in. So we're going to take the elements and structure them. So to begin with, I'm going to share with you the sort of broad structures of story and then relate that back to data, and then I'll come back to that data point we talked about and tell you how we then shape that into a simple story that fit within a thought leadership piece. So let me hide myself from the screen so you can see that. Okay, so story fundamentally is about as we said, it's the character conflict plot. It's about the hero going on this plot journey, meeting lots of problems and solutions to come to some kind of resolution. That's story at its very basic, if you like. That breaks down further into something called the 3-act structure, which you'll be very familiar with even if you don't know it as such. The beginning, middle, and the end becomes the challenge for a character, the struggle they go through, and the resolution. And they have 2 tipping points that take them over. So the struggle, the beginning of the story, is all about the sort of setup. into that world comes an inciting event, a moment that pushes them into a period of struggle that leads to a climactic event that then takes them to a resolution. And you can run pretty much any Hollywood story through this engine and you'll come up with this 3-act structure. How does that translate to what we're interested in? Well, really, it's 3 key points, which is, what do you know now? What is this piece of information that you have that is relevant? That's the challenge. I know this now, so what? The struggle is, how does that challenge, that thing that I know now, impact on either the consumer or brand, if that's the kind of data we're looking at, which we are here? How does this impact on a consumer or brand? And then finally, the resolution is, what could they, if we were talking to a brand or a consumer, do as a result of that? So the challenge is, what I know this, so what? The struggle is, how does what I know impact on brand or consumer? And finally, they could do this as a result of knowing that, getting through that struggle. So it's those 3 key points that give us that. So if we look back to this chart again, the example is that I know trust has fallen in the government, and through additional research I've discovered the context is it's because of perhaps inconsistent messaging. And if I wasn't 100% certain of that, because I know that quite a lot with research you have to be sure, I perhaps raise it as a question, said, is it because of inconsistent messaging? There is some evidence to suggest that. The impact of that could be that therefore consumers are turning to brands, are looking for a voice of authority. They're not getting the authoritative, trusted voice from the government at this time. So their struggle is, we can't find it anywhere. That would then turn into the final point, which is, therefore, a brand could be well placed to fill that gap by providing clear and consistent messaging. So really, really simply, just taking that idea of the data that tells us, okay, trust has fallen. I know that now. Therefore, where is the gap? There is a gap in terms of trust. How could brands fill it is the question. And that small thing just gives us a slight feel of a story, much more closely to a story arc than just going, this is the data point, here it is. The trust in government is currently only 40%, for example, or net trust. So hopefully you can see how the story arc is shaped there, and that that data alone isn't enough. We need to give it context. We need to build a story around it. I thought I would just, I'm just conscious that I've gone through that quite quickly, but hopefully that's sort of useful for you. I will just say this though, story is not for every occasion. Story is really useful for data and for insights, but it isn't for every single situation. And I'm not an advocate for just tell a story. There are times when it's not going to be appropriate. I would recommend that you start to think of your purpose based on this story continuum. So starting off thinking about, what is it you want the work to do, right the way back to that first message. Am I just informing? Am I explaining a situation? Or am I trying to sell an idea or inspire some change? And the closer you get to that sell and inspire type of action and purpose in terms of your story, that's when you really need to engage with story, engage with emotions, show and demonstrate the story arc, rather than just telling facts and leaving it all out there on table to be interpreted however it's interpreted. As we know, as I hopefully demonstrated earlier, when you leave it up to the individual, they'll make their own interpretation. Your role, I guess, as a communicator in this situation is to take data, to take an insight and translate it into a story. So I would just ask you, really think about, what are the stories you're seeing? What are the data points, and what's the story you can tell with that data? What's your personal story? How does that attach itself to data, for example? That's really all I wanted to say and all I wanted to share at this time. I think it'd be great if we could open up the floor to some questions, and hopefully I can answer them for you relating to story. So Robin, are you there?
I am just bringing up the camera. There we are. We are back. What a good, insightful session that was. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
And we've got about 300 people on this call, so
Mm.
that's fantastic. A lot of people hearing you today.
Yes,
So,
and they stayed.
so
That's great.
It really is, especially for the last one for the year. As Simon mentioned, it's now time for our Q&A. So we're going to be doing about 10-15 minutes, depending on how many questions that you have coming in. So as mentioned at the start of this session, if you just enter any questions or comments you have in the question pane at the bottom of the control panel, we can see how many we can get through. And I do have a question here just to get the ball rolling. So how much should you show your data / analysis in the presentation, as it tends to interrupt the story? Is it better in an appendix at the end?
Yeah, the way that we work with that is that I will tell the story shape, but I will pepper it with statistics and data, because I think that ultimately a lot of people are looking for it, but I won't overdo it. I'll make sure that they're quite spare. I would recommend that you perhaps use call out boxes with charts and with data to the side. And yeah, absolutely, particularly if it's large scale raw data, to the end. Leave it as far. Let people go and dive for it. You want to. The purpose of the story is to shape and focus their attention. Put it towards them, and then they can go and find, drill down into that data to really understand more about it, and to verify the story you're telling them.
Oh, questions are coming through nicely, so that was a good start. Let's see what we have here. Okay, let's go on. When presenting to multiple non-English speakers, would you change your approach in any way?
No, absolutely not. Story is universal, and stories are a human condition. They don't there's quite a bit of research about how story is a global phenomenon. The pattern of a story. You can go to Asia, you can go to the Americas, you can go to Europe, you can go to Africa, Australasia, and the pattern of a story is consistent. Of course, there are local variations. Of course, there are certain differences in terms of sagas, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about simple data and story points, and they do follow a very universal trend in terms of the brain as well. So yeah, I wouldn't change my approach.
Great. When you have lots of data, you can sometimes get lost in having too much information. What key things would you say to yourself to pull yourself out to get to a summary / story?
Yeah, I think the way that we work is we make sure that the narrative is nice and clear up front. And when I mean narrative, I mean, what are we trying to say? What's that narrative core insight and message that runs through the story? And that enables us to pick and choose the data that suits that narrative and that works with that narrative. The data is all there, but we're trying to move people into action or move people into a decision, and we're therefore using the data that reinforces and supports that. So what I would tend to do is work through the data that goes, this is my hypothesis, this is the hypothesis of the research, what has been met, what hasn't met, where are those tension points, and therefore create my story that way. And then not discount data, but don't necessarily include it in the core story. Keep it for the appendix, keep it for the drill down stuff afterwards.
Cool. Do you have any advice regarding the balance of words or visuals, numbers when telling a story?
It really depends on the medium you're choosing. We're obviously writing a lot of well, it depends. We do thought pieces and we do video. There's a great wealth of information on visual storytelling, and just again, particularly with what's happening in the US right now with the election, there's all you've got to do is look at some of the websites out there, and they have fantastic looking maps and graphs and charts. They are great examples of the sort of start of a story. The kind of things that I would say is that that needs a little bit of context around it. So you still need some language in there, some words in there, either a talk track or written language, to help shape and focus a person's attention. Again, it comes back to, if you leave abstract visual images up there for someone to interpret, they're going to shape the story the way they want to. If you want to direct their attention to a certain point, you need to use language. So I don't think you have to worry too much if you are writing a full piece to have lots and lots of whizzy visuals. You can just have good, strong call outs and good, strong graphs and imagery to help support you.
I'm liking this quick fire Q&A that we've got going on today, Simon. Working quite nicely. And there are more questions.
Great.
Here's the next one. So how is the story today structured for this webinar? Was it based on one of the models that you showed or on something else?
It is based on a different story model, actually. So if you look at so if I go back to the idea of inform, explain, sell, and inspire, this is based on an explain model. And that's a slightly different model to inspire. So it's a slightly different story model in that we front end a lot of context and explanation. The conflict points come slightly earlier and are reinforced at the end. So yeah, it is a different shape. If you want to explore that shape further, I would recommend a book by a chap called Dan Rome. He looks at the shape of presentation stories, and today's is based on, he calls it something else. I think he calls it learn, and we call it explain. So yeah, it is based on it's related. Message, character, conflict, plot are all still in there, but you reorder them in a slightly different way.
Great. And how can you show credibility through storytelling, as others may present and interpret data differently to a customer?
Well, I think you have to, you have to be honest and authentic with your storytelling. This isn't about a storytelling that is trying to do smoke and mirrors and distract people from the truth. Your data is still solid and real. You are just guiding people to see it and understand it the way that you want them to understand it. So I think authenticity in storytelling, reality, and being connected to the data is the way to do that. The other thing in terms of making sure that you are that it feels right and you've got that authenticity and relevance, is that you're not using unnecessarily dramatic language. I think it can be quite difficult for people when we're talking about conflict and tension to go, I need to up the drama. And I know quite a lot of the work I do, I've got a PR person trying to say, the thought leadership needs to do this. And I'm going, no, the thought leadership tells the story that the data tells. If you as a PR person want to take that and amplify it and spin it, for want of a better word, into a newsworthy story, that's separate from the thought leadership piece. The story of the thought leadership pieces is the authentic truth of the data.
And do you have any tips on telling stories with data to sell to customers?
To sell to customers, you mean when you're selling the data, I guess? Yes, I think the tip is your conflict point needs to, the tension needs to come much earlier in the story. So in the challenge struggle resolution that I showed you, that struggle is kind of in the middle of the story. That with if you're selling information or you're selling an idea, you have to bring that kind of to that first inciting event moment. The first moment of difficulty is where your biggest point of conflict comes, because it's a pain point for a customer. You then use the rest of the story to kind of ease that pain and resolve it through the data. So that's how I would do it anyway.
Okay. What's the best way to stick to a story and avoid waffling?
Well, you have to plan. You have to be much more planned with a story than if you were just kind of like going, this is what it's about, blah 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 blah. Map it out. Map out challenge, struggle, resolution. Map out the challenge is all about the context of your story. So make sure you've got a nice clear point there. The struggle, as I said, is all about the so what, why does that matter, what's that tension point, and then the final part is what can we do about it. And if you stick to that pattern, you are able to go slightly more freely around that, but you keep coming back to your point. So yeah, I would say plan it out.
And how is it best to manage interruptions? So sometimes one's delivering a great piece and telling the story that gets challenged midway, which can be difficult to pick up where you left off which impacts the emotion and energy. So do you have any tips on interruptions?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that quite often that is the case. I mean, clients will want to just get to the end. So if you are try and front end data as much as possible to just to let them see. Let's see. You're not trying to do a whodunit and reveal and reveal and reveal. That I think is a mistake in data storytelling. You can still give them the key insight up front, and then you can tell them the why through the story, the tension, the moment, and why it's important as a result. So that kind of generally, in my experience, that alleviates a lot of that, because quite often the interruption comes from, well, I just want to know this, I just want to know that. We know that people are time poor. The other thing to say is that let the person speak, but always hold on to you where you are and just say, that's great, thank you for that point. We'll be coming on to that in a minute. Or actually, I'd like an opportunity to take that out of the room and discuss it with you afterwards. And just re-own some of the energy in the conversation, and then get back into your story by either finding a way. You have to learn to be responsive. Quite a lot of the work I do with speakers and individuals around storytelling is their ability to respond in the moment. It's based on sort of improv, if you like, improvising. Don't react. Don't be caught up by their narrative. Hold on to yours and respond by going, yeah, that's a really interesting point. I'd like to come back to that in a moment, and just sort of take back charge as much as possible.
Somebody was wondering, how do you transition from factual to story without sounding fluffy?
Just do it. Don't say, I'm going to tell you a story. It's not a dark and stormy night. It's none of that. Just do it. And if it's the levels of storytelling you're using here, they don't have to be particularly elaborate. You're just trying to follow the brain structure of how it thinks and takes in information, how it follows narrative, to make sure that you are getting your point across effectively. So yeah, I think you just have to start, but you're not being too verbose and too wordy. You are just following that structure and just going straight on it. So don't signal, don't say, oh, let me tell you this story. Just go into it.
What key piece of advice would you give someone who sometimes doesn't find it easy to see what the data is telling them?
Get some help. I don't think sometimes this is true. As a content creator and copywriter, it's sometimes really difficult that you're left with lots of data that you're thinking, well, I'm not the person that knows what this means. So in those circumstances, I always go to the research company or the person who's working, who's done the research, and get them to work together with me on pinning down the narrative and the story. Quite often we'll have done that before we even get to results, and before we've got to shaping the story. We've made sure that the shape of the narrative that we want to tell, that we believe the data is telling us, is already there. But if you are really struggling to see it, you're just going to struggle in the numbers if you keep trying to go for it. So get another set of eyes on it, have a conversation, look out. I would say look upwards and outwards, and think about the context in which that data is currently living, so that you can go, oh right, okay. So for example, the example I gave, trust in government is demonstrably down at the moment based on handling of COVID. But it could be many things. It could be any number of things that demonstrates trust in any government. But what we know is what we're going through currently, and therefore there are news stories and articles that I was able to research and go, okay, yeah, so it looks like there's confusion about messaging that could lead to mistrust, because it's so you're just looking around rather than going into an isolated context.
Do you have any tips to frame or manage if the data doesn't match the narrative you were hoping for / expecting?
Yeah, I mean, it does happen. You have to tell the narrative the data is providing you with. You've got no option, unfortunately. And it does happen. You come up with a hypothesis and it doesn't. But that's interesting in itself. You can share. We've done thought leadership pieces where said, anecdotally we thought X, and the data tells us that's completely not the case, and therefore we would suggest the opposite thing. You always have to follow what the data is sharing for you, showing you. But yeah, it doesn't always tell you what you want it to sell, and that's obviously a difficult conversation to have, particularly with marketing, PR people who want to use this exciting data point and insight to sell more stuff. And you're going, yeah, but you can't, because it doesn't actually tell you that. I'd love it to, but it doesn't. What it tells you is this. So we need to change our course of action to this instead.
Okay. Well, I think I'm going to ask one question. We seem to have lots of questions that have come through. So really, clearly a very important topic that you're presenting on today, which is fantastic. How do you decide what story to tell from a large data set?
It really comes down to a discussion between the writer, the researcher, and a client. So if we have data, we have to look at it and go, based on what we're seeing, even if it's a large data set, are there, it tends to be segmented down. So we will try to cut it into sort of verticals, if you like, and think about, okay, this collection of points here is telling me one part of the story. This is another part. We can't tell everything. It's the same thing with any kind of story. If you tell everything, you tell nothing. You want to find the key story that helps you get your message across. Doesn't mean the data goes away. Doesn't mean the other data is useless. You've just got to be mindful and inquire between you about what is important for right now. Again, that comes back to a context thing. What is the product trying to do? What is the environment that product is working within? If you're talking about consumer products, yeah, just really thinking about what's relevant right now for a customer and how the data you're working with works with that. So yeah, it's a conversation, really is. It can take quite some effort and quite some time.